if you ever feel intense anger, frustration, resentment, hatred, if you easily get triggered, feel irritable, and if you easily get dysregulated and into the fight response of the fight or flight response, and you want to know how to deeply understand, work with anger so that you can transform it and transmute it, then hit like and hit subscribe, because today I'm going to tell you everything that you need to know about anger in order to transform it. So if you watched my last video on the fear family, fear, panic, and terror, then you learn to understand what your fear is telling you and how to transmute and transform it. And if you haven't seen that video, I'll link it at the end of this one so that you can go check it out. But today we are moving on to the anger family. Now, in my personal journey, anger wasn't an emotion that I often went to. I have much more experience with the fear family and the sadness family. So I would tend to go into the flight response or the freeze response, and also into deep sadness. So anxiety and depression, anxiety and sadness were the main two emotions and the main two families of emotions in which my body chose to respond to threats. But when backed into a corner, my first response wasn't to fight, it was always to flee and freeze. Then, of course, retreat into helplessness, hopelessness, and deep sadness. Now, just because you tend to go in one direction or the other doesn't mean that you don't have access to the full array of emotions that try to keep us safe. Anger is a fundamental emotion, and it arises when we perceive a threat, when we feel like we're in danger, when we perceive an injustice, we feel like something isn't fair or something isn't right, it needs to be made right. When there's some sort of a violation to our perceived or social boundaries. So that could be a moral boundary even, or a social boundary. If somebody crosses our boundary based on our own worldview and our beliefs and our identity, that can induce the emotion of anger. And anger is a very natural response that goes from mild irritation all the way up into intense rage. Anger is a very defensive emotion, and it's also a very expressive emotion, and it's also a very active and energetic emotion. So there's a lot of energy in the emotion of anger. And even though anger wasn't my go-to emotion over the course of my decade-long healing journey, it certainly had its places, and I certainly did experience the full spectrum of the anger emotion over time. It came and went in waves, particularly when I felt extremely threatened. So anger is often mostly triggered when you feel extremely threatened, when you feel extremely disrespected, extremely violated, extremely betrayed, or when your boundaries are violated in some way. It's also an emotion that rises often when people fail to meet our expectations. So we can feel frustrated with external circumstances and external experiences, but we can also feel extremely violated and betrayed on the inside. So anger comes from external circumstances, but it also comes from our inner experience. This emotion of anger is extremely evolutionarily and biologically effective. Its purpose, the reason we developed such an acute and, biologically important relationship with the emotion of anger is because it's part of the fight or flight response. So if you are extremely anxious, if you're extremely fearful, if you feel like you're threatened or you're in danger in some way, your fight or flight response is meant to keep you safe and is meant to help you survive at all costs. So in the last video, when we dove deeply into the emotions of fear, Fear is really our first evolutionary response to danger. It is the biggest one. So if you haven't seen that video, go check it out. But when we are backed into a corner with fear, we lash out in anger. Our instinct, if we can't get away, is to fight. So when we feel like we're in danger, our body chooses, without our emotions, without our mind being online or our brain or processing or anything like that, it chooses automatically whether we're going to fight or whether we're going to flee. So are we going to get away, or do we have to lash out at this threat and fight? You don't ultimately make this choice. Biology makes this choice for you in a split second. This emotion is based on self-preservation. It helped all of our early ancestors to survive threats and keep our species alive. Now, it didn't just do that for personal threats, right? It also did that to the group threats. It also serves to protect all of your resources and to defend your entire social world. This is why when, on social media today and when politics gets involved, people can become very angry and triggered very fast because there's a sense of anger involved when people cross boundaries politically and they feel like they need to keep their whole social world, all of their resources, and their community or their people intact because that personally helps them survive. So this is why in the world today, with everything being so politically charged, we see a lot of anger online. So anger arises when a personal or moral boundary that you've created, you've identified with, are crossed. They're violated in some way. And we feel a need to protect so that we aren't injured physically, emotionally, mentally, or spiritually. It's our instinct to prevent injury in any of these ways. So when people cross our social norms or they cross our emotional boundaries or violate any kind of our personal boundaries, we feel violated physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and we lash out to fight, to protect in order to survive. So it's a very primal response. Anger often encompasses many other emotions, right? It rises out of fear. So it does touch on the fear family of emotions. And it also arises out of deep hurt. So it touches on the sadness family. So when we're deeply feeling our anger and we allow ourselves to deeply feel this anger so that we can transform it, we're often tapping into more than just the anger family of emotions. We're facing our fears, we're facing our sadnesses and our griefs, and a lot of things, almost everything comes up that's underneath anger. Fear and sadness are both sitting underneath anger. They're deeper, they affect us at a deeper level, where anger is a more active response. It's less deeply held in the body than fear or sadness because it's expressive. Anger is expressive and it's very active and very highly charged. So often it doesn't get trapped in the body the same way that fear and sadness do, but it can get trapped in the body. And when anger gets trapped in the body, then we must also deal with the layers underneath anger. The hurts and the sadnesses and the griefs and the deeply held fears underneath anger. So when we're in deep anger, we know that we're not just in anger, we're in all the heavy emotions. And within the anger family, we have many different emotions that range from mild irritation to frustration. We have resentment, we have rage, and we have hatred. So we can really go from a mild emotion of anger, just like we tap into this sort of bite back, we're frustrated, we're irritated, all the way to deeply held rage and hatred that permeates through our entire being. So when we're talking about the anger family, Just like any family of emotions, we need to look at the whole spectrum in order to understand it and learn how to work and transmute it and transform it, which is essentially what needs to happen on a deep level with anger. So let's start out by looking at irritation. Most people will feel irritation on a daily basis, mild irritation. So it's a form of anger. It's in the anger family. These are minor annoyances and disturbances, things that feel unfair or block us from getting something done or meeting our goals, but they're not a direct threat on our survival. They're much more minor than that. So we may be triggered by these small circumstances or events that really, they just challenge our comfort. We may be annoyed by somebody else's behavior. It challenges our comfort. It's coming up to the edge of a boundary or the edge of what we feel comfortable with, or the edge of our peace, the edge of our happiness, the edge of our joy. We may start to feel this irritation. Now, this is a feeling, and we can notice irritation. We start to feel this sense of irritability in the body. We might have some thoughts of irritation in the mind. We might have a few uncomfortable emotions that start to come up that show us that we're irritated or annoyed. We might start to perceive a minor threat to our comfort, to our situation, to our control of our own experience. Catching anger in this minor form of irritation and annoyance is really the spot that you want to catch anger before it begins to build or really infringe or knock down your boundaries. We want to catch it when it's not life-threatening, when it hasn't truly crossed over or become a significant threat to us in some way. So what we want to do when we start to feel irritated, when we start to feel annoyed, is pause and breathe. That's always the first step, is taking a mindfulness approach, taking a moment, taking a pause, taking a breath, and feeling into the body, feeling into the thoughts, feeling into the emotion, feeling into the sensations of what's actually here and what's arising. Your body's telling you that you're going from a state of balance and equilibrium to slightly outside in the wrong direction of your balance, of your equilibrium, of your comfort, of your peace, right? Of this homeostasis. And so when we can identify it early on and we take a mindfulness moment, we take some deep breaths, we feel into the emotions and the sensations of the energy that's there in our body, we can begin to ask ourselves, is this worth my energy? Is it worth my attention? Is it worth the thoughts in my mind building? Is it worth the emotions and the energy that I'm expending on this right now? Is this worth it? Is it going to become an actual threat if I don't acknowledge it? Or is it something I can let go right here, right now, and bring myself back into peace and equilibrium? So we want to always try to reframe the situation and ask questions like, is it worth it to go down this path? Is it worth it to go more into survival, to protect myself from a threat? Or is it not really a threat? So we need to become aware of what's happening. Can I remove myself from the situation or the external experience that I'm in right now? Can I reframe this? Can I refocus my energy somehow? Can I do something differently? Can I engage in a more loving thought or a more peaceful thought? Can I shift my attention and my perception? Because often when we're in this stage of anger, it's so much easier to work with and to see that we can let it go. We can shift our focus. We can use a lot of tools from this place to move us if it's not worth our time, if we sense that a boundary is not really being violated, we're not really under threat, we can really move back into balance, equilibrium, and into happiness, into a feeling of peace and calm much more quickly and easily then if we start to trail unaware down this road of irritability and annoyance. So we really want to ask ourselves questions at this point. Are we being respected? Is this a challenge or a fight worth having? Is this worth spending our energy on? Can we easily shift our focus to something we prefer better? Can you shift your time? Can you shift your attention? Can you shift your control or your focus into something that you prefer at this stage if we've assessed that it's not a real threat? Do we need to say something, assert a boundary, draw a line, just be more assertive or confident at this point in our life, or is it something that we can completely let go? This is often the state when you have more of yourself online. You have more of the real, true self available to you to ask questions like this and to use your tools to really pull yourself back into the present, into the calm, into equilibrium, and stay there. Now, another emotion in the anger family is frustration. And frustration builds over time. Frustration has an energy about it that is a building energy. Often we ignore it when we're in irritability or mild annoyance. And if we continue down that road, we don't address it, we don't shift focus, we don't put up a solid boundary, we aren't able to bring ourselves back to our goals, to our focus of what we want, then we keep traveling down this road. Frustration builds, frustration gains momentum like a snowball rolling downhill. Frustration is active and it's energetic, and it can build quickly like a snowball. It can roll and grow much bigger, much more out of control if we allow frustration to continue down the hill without us intervening. So frustration usually occurs when our goals are blocked, when things don't go as planned, when something external or unexpected gets in the way, when we haven't addressed our irritability or annoyance, and we continue to let the annoyance and the irritability build, we start to get into a deeper form of frustration. Frustration signals that we have a growing problem. The energy is building. A goal is not being met. And frustration is, evolutionarily and biologically speaking, a motivator. The good side of frustration is to motivate us, to get us to take action. It launches us into a problem-solving mode. It gets the mind very active when we're highly frustrated. Evolutionarily speaking, it pushes us, right? It motivates us. We must adapt or change and build new strategies in order to achieve what we need to achieve. Because our goals are being blocked, we're not able to get where we want to go. We are not able to convince someone. We're not able to meet a goal. We're not able to get where we want. And this frustration is building, and it causes us to adapt. It causes us to problem solve. It causes us to start to get highly energized and activated. A personal boundary may have been crossed, and we sense that we're losing control of ourselves, of the experience, of the situation. And our values here are infringed upon. We aren't able to achieve or get to or accomplish something that we highly value. Again, when we are feeling this deep frustration, rather than brush it aside or distract from it, we want to take a pause again, a mindfulness approach, an open approach, rather than this narrow, focused, energetic approach that frustration pushes us and motivates us to start to charge through. If we can open more broadly, breathe, recognize everything else that exists except for this problem, then we can start to notice where in our body we feel the frustration. We can settle in and notice where the discomfort is, where the sensations are, what emotions are at play here, what thoughts are going round and round in our mind. And we can begin to ask ourselves questions that are going to be helpful about this frustration. What's the goal that's not being met? What is the expectation that's not being met? Where's the disappointment? What's being blocked? Is it a situation? Is it a boundary being crossed? Is there a person involved? Is there an expectation not being met? Is there a disappointment or a value that we hold that is under threat? When we can calm ourselves to the point where we can answer these questions, we can figure out what needs to be adjusted. Does our approach need to be adjusted to meeting the goal? Do we need new strategies? Do we need new tactics? Do we need a new focus? Do we need to set clear boundaries? Do we need to assert ourselves? Do we need to use more energy and focus? Are your expectations too rigid? What can you learn from this situation? How can you grow through this frustration? What new approach or strategies or techniques or tools can you use to make your way through in an appropriate way, to get what you want, to put a boundary in place, to accomplish your goal, to work on applying new solutions? Come when we are able to meditate and ground and use a mindfulness approach in the moment. We ground into the moment, we breathe into the moment, we recognize and feel what's here and what needs to change. We feel where this heightened energy of frustration is coming from, and then we apply a new solution mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, in order to accomplish what it is that we want to accomplish. So doing this can really help us from acting out of frustration, saying things we don't generally mean, having regrets later by blowing up, or just losing control mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically in the moment. So now let's really look at the intense emotion of anger, anger itself. So if we feel threat, injustice, if we feel like we're being violated, if we feel like we're under threat, if we feel like any personal, moral, social boundaries are being crossed, if we can't get away from it, if we can't turn away from it, then we will feel the emotion of anger. It's a natural response to fight, to show where the boundaries are, to show where the line that cannot be crossed is, and to keep our survival intact, to keep our sense of self intact, to keep our values, our morals, our identity, our beliefs intact. This is a form of self-preservation when it comes to anger. So again, if we're feeling irritated and we let that go, or frustrated and we let that go, or threatened or betrayed, or anything right in the moment, when our boundaries are violated or crossed in some way, when our circumstances are not going how we want them to, when people are disappointing us, when our expectations are not being met, we often feel triggered in the moment and respond with anger. This is a normal reaction. It is part of the fight or flight response. Some people retreat in fear and some people lash out in anger. The fight or flight response is preparing us to either fight for survival or run for our survival, to get away. So often people are either lashing out or they're withdrawing. They're doing one or the other when their boundaries are crossed, when something isn't going their way, when something's not being met, when they're not being heard. The initial response will either be withdraw, get away, or anger, the more active form of letting people know where those boundaries are. Now, anger is a natural response. It's a biological response, but it also usually has a lot of deeper layers to it if you find yourself continually getting angry. Because although sometimes it can just be an impulsive reaction, if it's happening over and over, it points to a pattern in our life that needs to be fixed. It points to a situation or an experience or a relationship that needs to be fixed. If you are continually triggered and lashing out in anger, then it's more than just an evolutionary response to the moment. It's signifying a deeper pattern or experience or relationship that needs fundamental change. So again, when we're dealing with anger, the first response is always to diffuse it with mindfulness, with present moment awareness, just taking a few breaths, opening up our heart, opening up our breath, This breaks the cycle and gives everything more space. This helps us be able to take a moment to let the energy of anger sort of dissolve enough that we can respond from a more neutral or more balanced way, a less charged way, a less highly activated response is what we're looking for. When we take 60 seconds to stop, to breathe, to open up, to be present in the moment, we can come back to a place of, okay, we can ask the questions of what's really happening so that we can respond in a way that's not going to cross other people's boundaries, that's not going to be aggressive or defensive or have us respond in a way that we're going to feel regret, shame, or guilt about later. And those are different emotions that we will talk about in another video. But when we can be mindful, breathing, grounding into the moment, and then using somatic practices and somatic exercises to feel the anger pulsing in our body, moving through our body. Where do we feel it? What does it feel like? Allowing this tension, this heat, this clenching muscles, this activated energy to surge and to move around and dissolve by helping it with breathing, with movement, with shaking, with even physical energy, physical exercise. This is where walking, running, using physical energy to help disperse this highly charged, activated emotion of anger. We can come back into balance much more easily and then feel into the calm of the present moment. When we do that, we can access our self-control and we can access our self-awareness. We can start to ask ourselves questions so that we can solve the problem and solve the situation, not just instinctually bite out in anger that may lead to regret, guilt, and shame if we're not acting appropriately. Remember, it's rarely about what's happening in the moment. With anger, sometimes it is, but often it's pointing to a pattern or built up resentments of a bunch of anger that hasn't been allowed to be expressed or felt, or personal boundaries or personal disappointments or something that hasn't been said, an unjust or unfair treatment. And so we really want to be careful when we respond in anger that we're doing so with our full self online, with more self-awareness online, with a constructive approach of problem solving, which we rarely do when we're in the heightened, emotional, activated state of anger. So we need to work with that anger first and settle it into a way that now we can actually address what's underneath it. We can start to look for what the root of our frustration is, or what the root of why we're feeling so irritable, or what boundaries have been crossed, or where we're not being heard, or where we're disappointed continually, right? What the pattern and what the root is, what needs to be said that hasn't, what needs to be made right that hasn't. Where do we need to be understood where we haven't yet been understood? What do we need to say where we've continually suppressed it? How do we need to feel loved or cared for where we don't? These are really important questions to ask when it comes to anger, when it comes to feeling triggered and responding in anger continually. Because if we don't deal with our anger and we continually let anger build up over long periods of time, we can find ourselves feeling resentment now. Resentment is usually a form of anger that we've let build over time. We've let this irritation, we've let this frustration go unaddressed. We've pulled back our boundaries. We've let them be infringed upon. We've let this unfair or unjust treatment continue, the situation continue, the relationship continue. And we've pulled back our expectations, we've pulled back our boundaries, we've given more and gotten less. We've maybe been betrayed. And this accumulates over time. Our sense of feeling wronged by others, infringed upon by others, taken advantage of by others, feeling like we've been treated unfairly or unjustly by others, feeling misunderstood, feeling uncared for by others, whether it's in a personal relationship or work relationships or just social friendships, your community. When we let irritation and frustrations build over time without addressing them, we start to build a form of anger, which is called resentment. And it's a form of anger that has gone unaddressed. Resentment is anger that is buried, that has been pushed down, and that has not been transformed, transmute, or worked with in any way. This frustration, this irritability, if not addressed, leads us into resentment. It's anger that is unaddressed. And evolutionarily and biologically speaking, the reason we're adapted to feel this resentment is so that we know what's right and wrong. We get a sense of what's fair and what's unjust. And over time, if we have repeated violations of what's fair, of boundaries being crossed, then evolutionarily and biologically speaking, it shows us who needs to be held accountable or let go in the group. It causes us to withdraw or limit our social interaction with individuals who won't be there for us. So biologically speaking, this would push us into better relationships, better social groups, and a way of keeping ourselves more intact and more safe from threat. So morally speaking, personally speaking, ethically speaking, if we feel like a boundary or a value of ours is being crossed, then we are no longer in alignment with this person, with these people, with this tribe, and our safety is at risk. So that's why it's important to note, if you're feeling resentment, this is a deep primal emotion that needs to be addressed. We let it linger, we let it continue because we want to believe that these people are our tribe, our family, the people that are there for us and going to protect us. And we've let our sense of self slip into the background in order to keep them in our life so that we don't offend or we don't risk losing. But this resentment, this unaddressed anger grows and hurts us internally. So when we have suppressed anger that has never been addressed, if we don't address it, we can end up with a lot of physical or emotional illnesses that have to be felt somehow in the body. Resentment is a form of anger that's suppressed. It leads to us breaking down in other ways because we can't restore balance or homeostasis without addressing it. So if you notice that most of your anger is resentment or being repressed, you find yourself that you resent situations and people and experiences all the time, then you must allow yourself to feel and express the unexpressed anger that lives within you. So you need to go back and give yourself permission to fully feel this anger, to fully feel the hurt, to fully feel the violation, to fully feel the rejection, to fully feel the injustice, and to really look at it. This is where the deep work or shadow work comes into play when we're dealing with anger, this deep inner work, looking at the shadow, looking at the parts that have been shoved down, suppressed, rejected, denied, and disowned, but are underneath the surface at all times. And every time we bump into a situation that reminds us that we haven't fully felt this anger or we haven't fully made these injustices right, we feel triggered. We feel resentment to the world and everyone living in it. We feel resentment to the ones we love most. And so if we know that we feel a lot of resentment in life, we want to find out why, where these injustices first came from, where these boundaries were first crossed. mentally, emotionally, physically? Where is the root of this anger that was never expressed? We really want to look at this and find this, because that's what actually needs to be healed, not the resentment that you feel in the moment, but the initial or the root reason, the injustices, the boundaries that were crossed in a mental, physical, or emotional way at some point in your life that you didn't allow yourself to stand up for yourself, or to feel that anger, or to set your clear boundaries in some way. So the work that you need to do is try to get to the root. Try to ask yourself questions that lead you to the root of the injustice that you feel. And then we need to go about setting it right. How do we set something right? We may need to tell the person. We may need to talk this out. We may need to set clear and new boundaries in our life. We may need to forgive others and or forgive ourselves. Often resentment is about forgiving yourself for not standing up for yourself at the time, for allowing this injustice to go on long term. You're not actually usually as angry at the person as you are about yourself for allowing your own boundaries to be crossed or violated, your own values to go unheard, unrecognized, to allow parts of yourself to be violated or ignored. And these are the parts that need to be made right. So now let's really look at the extremely intense emotion of rage. Rage is intense, it's overwhelming, it swallows you, and it leads you to being out of control. You're completely out of control, blindly reacting in an explosive energy of anger because you've let it build so long. Anger has built and built momentum. The snowball is so big that you've completely lost control of rational thought, of being able to be grounded in the present moment. And anger is now highly charged, highly activated, completely intense. And this is where we feel rage. Now, rage is usually triggered by an extreme violation, by something that we perceive is an extremely threatening violation of our safety. Rage comes from life-threatening boundaries being crossed, from life-threatening injustices, from extreme violation of our boundaries, of our personal and social boundaries, from attacks on us, personal attacks. When someone crosses violently, either physically, mentally, or spiritually, our personal boundaries, your family, your health, your identity, your worldview, when these boundaries are crossed in an extremely violating way, you will feel the emotion of rage. It's not just anger building up over time. Something usually happens to trigger rage. There's a line that's been crossed when we feel rage that really threatens our survival, that threatens our sense of self, that threatens us in such a deep way that the response can only be so heightened and so extreme where we lose all control. Now, rage is an extremely biologically necessary emotion to defend against severe physical threats or severe emotional or moral threats on your family or on your life or on your health. Rage is necessary for survival. Rage is the force that allows a mother to lift a car off their baby. Rage is so powerful. Rage is energetic. Rage is strong, and rage can defend you against bear attacks, tiger attacks in the wild, against armies, against threats, against rapes, against personal violations. When you feel like your life is at stake and you are threatened in an extremely dangerous way, rage comes in to save the day, to give you this burst of energy that nothing else can give you to save your life. It is the most powerful emotion that can cause you to be physically, mentally, and emotionally strong. It's decisive. It acts quickly. It acts with power. It says no. It draws clear lines and boundaries, and nothing can break through them. And it protects at all cost. And rage often only comes forward when you feel that you're backed into a corner with no other option. You aren't able to stand up for yourself. You aren't able to speak your truth. You aren't able to preserve your values. You aren't able to protect yourself, your life, your body, or your family. When you feel like you have no other option, you're backed into a corner and your only option is to fight for survival. This is where rage became biologically and evolutionarily necessary to save your life. So when we're working with the emotion of rage, being able to be in a safe place, a safe space, with safe people around you, with people who can help, so that you can feel this rage fully through physical movement, through maybe punching, kicking, screaming, primal movements, primal body movements, primal body movements, primal body noises, primal body screams. We want to be able to feel this rage that wasn't able to be felt at the time, or that has been suppressed and never made right. So when we're dealing with making rage right, we need to get back into the original. What line was crossed? What boundary was crossed? What violation occurred? And we want to feel this physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. We need to allow ourselves to experience it fully in a safe place, so that we can now draw clear boundaries, make what was wrong right, stand up for what we believe, say what needs to be said, do what needs to be done, reevaluate the relationships, the people in your life. Rage often means understanding where the violation was, and it means forgiving yourself and your part for allowing this to happen, for not being able to protect yourself, for not drawing those clear boundaries, for not being able to say it then, stand up for yourself then. There's often deep sadness and grief underneath this explosive rage. There is usually something that's been lost that needs to be restored, or something you're extremely afraid of losing. There's something in some way that has been lost and needs to be restored, a boundary that has been broken and needs to be restored, a hurt that has happened that needs to be felt and needs to be grieved. So there's often deep sadness and grief underneath rage. There's often the deep grief of the violation itself, of the loss itself. And people often use anger and rage and the active emotion of this anger family to protect themselves from really feeling the fear and the sadness and the loneliness and the hopelessness and the deep grief of what's occurred underneath the hurt and grief from the violation that is underneath this rage. And so when we're transforming rage, we are always working with the activated feeling of this anger and rage in our body somatically. We're working with it energetically. It's a forceful emotion, so we never want to try to calm it. We want to allow ourselves to feel it in a safe space until it transforms enough that we can open in breath, that we can ground ourselves into the present moment, that we can come back into mindfulness, and that we can start to address the deeply held grief that lives underneath this rage. And finally, I want to address the emotion of hatred, which belongs in this family of anger. It is a deep, long-lasting, intense emotion of anger, a deep feeling of rage, a deep feeling of hurt, a deep aversion or disdain for something or someone who is perceived as a threat or an adversary for your life. We don't hate someone for no reason. Hatred, real pure hatred, usually arises when we have experienced betrayal, cruelty, profound and deep injustice, a prolonged, long resentment for someone who has continually violated our boundaries over a lifetime, or experiences or people or situations that made us feel powerless and continue to take, threaten, or steal our power. Hatred is biologically and evolutionarily necessary for maintaining social cohesion in this world. It's an adaptive response for knowing who your enemies are, for protecting yourself, your family, and your community against an enemy, against a threat, against these enemies who continually invade, threaten, or violate your values, your community, your family, or yourself. So hatred was there to show us how to cut off, keep our distance, or take action against someone else, against another group of people, or somebody else who continually threatens your safety, the safety of yourself, your community, and your family. So it helps us know who the most harmful and dangerous individuals are to your sense of self and safety, to your sense of family, to your sense of being okay in this world. So if your moral or ethical values have been crossed, have been personally violated, have been personally betrayed, or you've experienced cruelty or injustice or personal harm, we experience hatred because we have experienced a moral, physical, ethical, emotional, or spiritual wrong that often cannot be made right, or that threatens us in an ongoing way. It threatens our sense of who we are. It threatens our sense of safety and justice in the world. Now, when we're talking about hatred, if you often feel hatred to a person or a group of people, or even a political party or anything, when we're talking about hatred, we're talking about a deep wound. We're talking about inner work that must be done. Deep wounding has occurred. Deep betrayal, deep moral outrage has occurred. Deep harm, deep hurt, a deep and ongoing threat is present. And so when we're working with this emotion, we need to allow ourselves to feel the anger, to feel the grief underneath the anger, to acknowledge the hurt and the loneliness and the betrayal and the loss that has occurred in our life because of this unjust or violation or betrayal that we've experienced. This is where shadow work really comes into play. I like to do deep shadow work when you're working with feelings of hatred. You know that the shadow is at play when you're experiencing hatred. Journaling, writing exercises, really getting things out can be extremely beneficial when you're working with these deeper feelings of hatred, right? Being heard, talking about it. Forgiveness practices are extremely important. Not to forgive or let the other person or the group of people off the hook. That's never the point of forgiveness. It's often forgiving ourselves for allowing this betrayal to happen, for not seeing it, for not doing enough. It's usually forgiving ourselves for being human, for whatever part or role we played in this, and a lot of letting go practices so that we can release the emotional weight that comes with hatred. Because hatred, grief, these are very heavy emotions, and they come with an extremely heavy weight on our heart, on our emotional world. And so when we work with forgiveness practices, when we do deep shadow work, when we work with letting go, we can restore peace back into our heart. And from this place of peace and balance and equilibrium, we can begin again. We can begin fresh. We can set new boundaries. We can set new moral codes. We can strengthen our own personal beliefs and values. We can create new identities. We can strengthen our existing identities, our existing values. We can learn more efficient tools to dealing with anger or threat. We can learn how to deal with it in a healthier way, in a more constructive way that points us in the direction of the life that we actually want, rather than staying trapped and confined within the walls of a jail cell that we create for ourselves when we stay in these thick, heavy emotions of rage, deep resentment, deep hatred. When we stay within these feelings, we become trapped within our own self, within our own body becomes trapped. And we need to find a way to transform and break out of this cell that we've created ourselves in. We've created these walls for protection. We've created these thick boundaries now and walls and basically a cell, but it leaves us no room to move or to live or to experience happiness, joy, peace, comfort, success, abundance, all the things that we want, because these walls are so thick and we're so afraid of tearing them down. We don't want to feel betrayed or hurt again. And so we really need to experience what happened to us fully, to be able to put words to it, to feel heard, to feel witnessed, to forgive ourselves and others, to learn how to let go so that we can move back into equilibrium and we can design and build a life that we want. We can break down the walls that we've put ourselves in for protection, and we can begin to trust again, love again, and open ourselves again to ourselves, to our family, to the world around us, to our friends, to our community, and to the world at large. So working with hatred is about learning how to open and learning how to design a life again that allows us to live and to feel safe and to feel loved and to feel valued and to feel a sense of justice as we move forward in our lives. Now, the feelings of jealousy and envy belong in the anger family, but I'm going to discuss these in another video because this video is getting extremely long. And so to wrap up this video, we have to realize and recognize that anger isn't bad, that listening to our anger or being aware of our triggers gives us clues to exactly what is wrong, to exactly what needs to be healed, to exactly where we feel a boundary's been crossed or a relationship is broken or an injustice has been created. Anger is active. It helps us protect our needs. It helps us assert ourselves to create boundaries. And when channeled properly, anger is assertive action, right? Anger leads us and prompts us into assertive action. It helps us to make sure that we're not betrayed, that we can depend on ourselves. It draws clear boundaries. It helps us move and take action and problem solve, and actually helps us in our relationships to know what is right, what is wrong, what we accept, what we can't accept. But when anger plays out over a long period of time, or when anger continually or triggers continually come up, when resentment builds, when frustration builds, this can point to unresolved wounds underneath it, a problem that really needs to be fixed and an injustice that really needs to be restored. And when we're working with things like jealousy, which we didn't touch on this video, and rage and hatred, we're really working with the shadow and our underlying vulnerability, our underlying hurts, our underlying grief. And when we address these root causes, we can help to heal the anger itself. We can start to restore better relationships. We can start to restore peace in our life. We can start to restore balance. We can start to open again to others and the world. So rather than letting the emotions of anger lead us down a road of resentment and bitterness and disconnect and withdrawal and hatred and passive aggressive behavior and angry outbursts and damaging our relationships, we can work with anger by feeling it, by allowing it, by learning from it, by somatically expressing it in the body, and by investigating the root cause of what's underneath the anger. What needs to be made right? What can you learn from this situation? How can you grow from this situation? How can you let go of what is beyond your control? How can you forgive? How can you forgive or let go of something that you cannot change or fix or solve? What are the lessons for your personal growth? How can you allow yourself to become more personally empowered? How can you build better relationships with yourself and others? How can you strengthen your beliefs, your morals, your values, your worldview, your boundaries? How can you go from someone who's a victim to someone who's the hero, to someone who takes responsibility for their life, for themselves, for their actions, and for their reactions? How can you develop a stronger sense of self, learn to meet your own needs? In what ways can you forgive yourself? In what ways can you free yourself? In what ways can you grieve? In what ways can you let go? In what ways can you unburden your soul? In what ways can you learn to love again? Can you learn to trust again? In what ways can you advocate for yourself? Can you stand up for yourself? Can you show up for yourself? And can you love yourself unconditionally? And can you learn to never leave yourself, to always show up for yourself? In what ways can you integrate the shadow side of yourself, the unconscious aspects of yourself that you have been unwilling to confront, that you've been unwilling to feel? How can you acknowledge the destructive side of the anger while using it in a constructive way? How can you develop deep introspection to understand and transform this energy of anger, this energy of hatred, this energy of rage into one of love, into one of balance, into one of wholeness, into one of resilience, into one of empowerment, into one of self-compassion, of self-love, of self-forgiveness, and of growing and opening, allowing yourself to trust, to open, and to feel safe in the world once again. And this is how we transform and transmute the energy of anger. So if you enjoyed this video and received value from it, please go ahead and hit the like and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you have not yet watched the video on fear, go ahead and watch that now. I will be back to conclude this mini series on emotions as we really talk about and look at the emotions of sadness in the next video. If you want to learn more about how to work with me or take my program, you can check that in the links below. I'm sending you all my love, and I will see you in the next video.